So let's take a look at this example scene from Quake. And you can see that this is an enclosed room with a few light sources, some light bouncing around. And if you try to compute illumination for this kind of environment, the first thing that you can invent, or rather, first thing you can implement easily, is random hemisphere sampling with cosine weights. And this is what will happen if you do that. For example, you compute the lighting for a surface here, and you shoot a ray in a random direction. That ray happens to hit this brick wall, and that wall is fairly dim. Okay, fine, we store that radiance in the pixel. For another pixel, we trace a ray in another direction, we get a slightly brighter color. Okay, cool. But once in a while, our ray will hit a direct light source. And light sources are orders of magnitude brighter than other surfaces in the room, because they are emissive. And because they are also small, in this case, the probability of a random ray hitting a light source is very small. So what you get in the result is a very small subset of rays that hit the lights, and they are extremely bright compared to other pixels. And that's the result, basically this picture of snow in space or something like that. Even if you do a lot of samples per pixel, or if you accumulate that for many frames, it still is very noisy. So that's not the way to go, obviously. That's very expensive. And you may say, like, hey, we can try to apply a denoiser because the denoisers are great. No, not really. I mean, no, this is not yet denoised, but if we turn on the denoiser that is tuned for global illumination, like low-frequency signals, it kind of looks okay, but there is like all these artifacts, all the oatmeal, just unusable, basically. And that's even without specular lighting, which is turned off. And if I turn it back on, that's what happens. Again, the denoiser is not perfect, but it's pretty much impossible to denoise that. So a better approach would be to use a technique called next event estimation, which is a form of importance sampling. And the idea here is that, yes, we still trace random rays, and rays in random directions, but we also trace rays that are directed towards local lights. So let's say we have, again, a random ray that hits a surface, fine. Another random ray that would hit a light, but in this case, if we detect that it's a light, we ignore it. Because we collect light using a separate set of rays. It can be 2 rays per pixel, it can be a subset, like some pixels get one path, some get another. There are options. But anyway, we have to trace a dedicated set of rays towards local lights. And when we do that, we get a fairly dense sampling of local lights in the scene. Basically, every or almost every ray that we cast toward the light will get some high amount of radiance multiplied by the projected area of that light, unless it's in shadow. So that's the result. Compare that to random sampling. Obviously much better. And in a few frames, it will accumulate to a completely clean picture, which is great. And obviously, you can also denoise that very effectively with a real-time denoiser. In this case, it was ASVGF, as was implemented in Quake 2 VKPT earlier, before us. And it's all completely usable. Stable, there is pretty much no artifacts in these occlusions other than slightly noisy pixels, and that's about it. So we can basically conclude that section with a very simple statement that importance sampling is important, obviously. And it's been around, all these techniques have been around for years and decades, where researchers have spent all the time trying to optimize offline path tracers for movies and such to converge faster, to make rendering cheaper. In case of real-time ray tracing, we have to apply the same techniques because our ray budgets in real time for real-time applications like games are very limited. And if you try to run a game, if you try to run ray tracer in real time, let's say 30 or 60 FPS, you are limited with RTX GPUs to something like, to basically a handful of rays per pixel, at most like 5, 8, something like that. You cannot do hundreds. At the same time, as we learned by releasing Quake 2 RTX, gamers still expect that games are playable at something like 60 FPS at 4K because, like, hey, I paid $1,200 for this fancy GPU. Why do I get only 20 FPS? The whole idea that this is path tracing and kind of a holy grail of the graphics is getting above them. So, yeah. So basic goals of designing a real-time array or path tracer would be something like that. First of all, spend as few rays as you can because of the budget. And since you have very few rays, you have to spend them where it matters most. I mean, you have to direct them towards where you expect the light to come from and not just in any random direction, because otherwise you get that kind of noise that I was showing before. And while you do that, you design the algorithm to also cooperate with the denoiser using techniques such as low discrepancy sequences, blue noise, so that the spatial blur can be more effective. And you also should pass more information to the denoiser, such as surface parameters like normals, albedo, basically all the parameters to evaluate parts of the BRDF and decompose the lighting signal in the components, denoise them separately, and combine back, so that you can use different algorithms for denoising different kinds of signal, like diffuse and specular, or diffuse direct and diffuse indirect. But while you are designing the algorithm to work with the denoiser, it's very important to also verify that your results are close to reference, which means you would have an unbiased path tracer, maybe even with completely random sampling to validate your light sampling algorithms and things like that. And also, very importantly, to validate that the denoisers are energy conservative and are not introducing bias by themselves.